May 18th. Put the battery on a quick charge this morning. But sometimes just seeing where everything is and how it looks, this hopefully will go well. I want to just get it from the... Okay. Alright. Did you try starting it, Jeff?
Yeah, I did try turning it over yesterday.
Did it start?
I did not try to get it started because I didn't know how much antifreeze was still sitting in the engine. I didn't want to take the chance.
Okay.
So we'll see what happens.
Okay, here we are. Pump is in. We were able to get manifold off, pump in 45 minutes. Well, let's say the manifold off in 45 minutes. Then we ran into a problem with the pump, being that the gear on the bottom of the pump was wrong. Okay, here we have the pumps. The pump on the right, the gear on the bottom of the pump on the right is the correct gearing for the jack shaft and the TR7. The gear on the left pump is for a Saab. The casings, everything is basically identical. The impellers are a little bit different. Some of the portholes are a little bit different in the brass casing, but if it wasn't for that gearing, we'd be okay. But because of that, we had to go find another pump, which is now in the car. In the meantime, Jeff is doing some work on the carburetors.
What we're basically doing here,
Yes, Jeff.
is where we've taken out the original valves that were in the carburetor, and we are installing gross jets in the two carburetors. It will assist the car in behaving, the float, in maintaining a more constant
Gross jet.
Let me lift it up if I can.
Can you get that?
There it is. That is a gross jet as opposed to the standard jet, which looks something like that. Notice, if you will, that the standard jet uses a piston type affair to move, open and close the valve, whereas the gross jet uses two balls, one on top of the other, that ride on the float, and therefore providing a more accurate metering system for fuel as it goes into the carburetor bowl. What we're also doing is that this car seems to have had a leak, which could have possibly been water, but because the fluid that we kept getting was cold, I am more positive was probably fuel. What we found is on the bottom of these carburetors are two drain plugs, like this, that are snapped into this cover. In each one of the plugs, there are O-ring gaskets. This is the one that came out of the plug that's in this carburetor bowl. You snap these out and then just roll the old O-ring gasket off and roll another one onto the plug, and then snap the plug back in after you coat both liberally with Vaseline to make sure they don't get pinched. On later carburetors, such as this set, there is no plug, but it's a sealed bottom bowl. Now, we could have changed these over, but we're going under the assumption that to stay with the original carburetor and use the original parts. So what we're doing here is, rather than cannibalizing these carburetors, we're going to leave them intact and go with the original setup that was on the original carburetors. Right now what we're doing is I'm getting ready to reinstall the float bowls on the forward carburetor. We've coated the gaskets with some Permatex Ultra Blue just to make sure that any mating surfaces, irregularities in either the carburetor or the bowl get taken care of. And now we're just going to real simply reinstall the two together. Now, one of the things you should note when you're doing this is that the carburetor uses different sized bolts in different locations. You have four screws rather, that are of the same size. Then you have two shorter ones. The two shorter ones go on the air supply side of the carburetor on the outer edges, left and right. The longer screws fill up the rest of the holes, like so. When you screw these back down, you want to make sure that they are snug, but if the screws stop before they get to that point, then you got to believe that there's something that's keeping them from going all the way down. So you want to take them back out and take the bowl off and check to make sure that there's nothing wrong. Then it's just a matter of making sure you screw these down good and tight. Make sure that each one of the screws have lock washers on them so that they won't vibrate loose once you get the assemblies back together again. You want to make absolutely certain that they're down. Now what I'm doing here also is I'm not tightening them down in a round sequence. I'm trying to tighten them down in somewhat more of a roundabout so that the pressure on the new gasket and such is equally distributed as it goes down. Now when we took this bowl off, there was no sealant on the gasket. So chances are it really isn't necessary for you to have it, but it's probably a good idea just as a precaution to put it on. Now once we get all of the bolts tightened down here, what we're going to do is we're going to go around again just to make sure that all of them are as tight as they can get. You don't want to go ape on this stuff because again you're going into an aluminum housing.
And you could snap off one of the heads of those bolts.
And you could snap off one of the heads, or you could strip out the housing. Neither one is a terribly acceptable practice. All right.
Okay, we're going to the other
Front
one.
carburetor's done.
Still not
Now we'll begin the same process on the rear carburetor. Using basically the same procedure. It's not really necessary that you do, but I like to do it this way just for my own edification. Now the reason I suspect that these plugs have been leaking is if you take a look, you'll see that it's wet all around on the bottom here and all around the top of the plug. Now the only place really where anything can be wet like that and still get fluid would be coming from underneath here, which is where the carburetor, the gasoline rather, fuel sits in the carburetor bowl. And it only happens after the car's been running, which leads us to believe that that's the main culprit, plus the fact that when I've knocked both of these off, the carburetors have basically been, the bowls were basically dry. So, we'll remove, oh, I thought I got that one all the way out. Now if you're going to rebuild the entire carburetor, this is definitely something you want to check for, and again, going back to what I was saying before, they're the two different sizes of screws that you have to deal with. Very gently.
Got it. Yeah, I was going to say I put the rubber hammer in there too.
Rubber hammer is probably preferred over what I just did. Now again, you'll notice no fuel came out of this bowl, the bowl is basically bone dry, which still a pretty decent indication that it was leaking out of here through the O-ring that was underneath. Now, here we have the installation for the original carburetor valve, float valve. You can see what it looks like. All right, that's a new carburetor valve that would come with the rebuild kit. So if anybody needs valves and doesn't want to go for the gross jets, I do have an additional set right now.
And that was the other gross
The other
jet.
gross jet.
It's just to show the difference
Here. All right.
on the ball bearing as compared to the needle valve type. This is the one you want. Because when these stick open,
When these
gas just pours out of them.
and it pours out, it usually winds up pouring out of the most inopportune places too. Right? When we were working with the Red 7, my other car, my convertible, we would be getting fuel out of the weep orifices. We didn't know why until we came to this part, so you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, I've just snapped off the float assembly. I'm going to keep it upside down here, so I'm orienting it exactly the way it went in to the original, in its original installation.
Okay.
Now,
Very good.
removing the is it 13 or 14? It's the 14. Okay, now the sizes for the gross jet and the original needle are slightly different. The original needle is apparently somewhere around 14 millimeter. And that just screws right out. Like so. Now, there is a screen on the needle valve. In doing the first one, I noticed that these are not that readily wanting to come off, nor do they seem to fit that well onto the gross jet. So we're going to try it on this one and see if it fits any better. If it doesn't, we're just going to go without the screen entirely, which may or may not be a recommended practice. But rather than it fitting loosely and falling out at the most inopportune of times, you see this is the same thing. That there's a friction fit and it really doesn't fit well. So we're going to leave this alone. We're going to discard the filter. Now, with the gross jets, they will come with one or more washers. You'll use only the washer supplied with the gross jet. And before you screw it back in, you want to clean as best as possible down into the orifice where the jet fits, because any dirt that's in there could wind up getting into the new valve. Sometimes this would probably be better accomplished if you have a picking tool to get into the threads itself. Failing that, you can just clean them up peripherally with a regular screwdriver and some cloth. Now, the new one simply screws down into place like so. This is a 1/2 inch, and you just take the 1/2 inch now, gently start threading it down to make sure you don't cross thread it. Again, you're working with an aluminum body here. You don't want to bugger the threads. The only thing buggering the threads is going to do is give you considerable grief. You just keep turning that.
Especially when you're looking for a new carburetor.
Especially when you're looking for a new carburetor. I mean, I have the added advantage of having another set, but I really don't want to go ahead and go through that grief if I don't have to. So a little bit of caution in the outset is worthwhile. Okay, that looks like she's down all the way. Again, don't go ape on these things. It doesn't pay. Now we can start taking off the old gasket. Now you may ask, why didn't I do that first? Now, honestly, this is the type of thing where I don't really believe that it makes a difference when you do it in the part of the operation, so long as you're careful.
Yeah, but you don't want to get the flakes down in the ports either.
That's true.
Another thing on these intake manifolds, this TR7 manifold, you have an O-ring over here on the intake side. This sits on the head, and this O-ring is for coolant. Make sure you change that O-ring before you go putting the intake manifold back on. This one looks pretty good, but nevertheless, you got a new one, you take that off, put a new one on there so you have a good seat.
Yeah, these are the types of little things that don't cost a whole lot of money, and in the interim will provide you with considerably more grief if you don't do it than if you do. The amount of time that you've spent extra on something like that is negligible as compared to what happens if you don't. Just clean that up a little bit more.
Okay, I think we'll cut here for now.
Talking about before, this is the plug that comes out of the bottom of the float bowl. Now, this is the O-ring that came out of it. It's got a little bit of a cone shape to it. I don't know if the camera can pick that up or not.
Okay.
Maybe on a profile like that, it might be better seen.
Okay.
But I suspect that's probably where part of the problem is on this particular carburetor. Now, when you get the carburetor rebuild kits, they come with a couple of different gaskets that look very similar. You've got these two shallow, small O-rings, and then you've got this one large one.
Just pull them out a little bit. I'm pulling in on this now.
Okay.
There you go. And you just move them down into the, there you go, so you can see them. Yeah.
All right. The larger O-ring is the one that you want to use. Chances are it's going to look smaller than the one that we pulled out, which is the one on top now. The reason for that being is the aging and stretching process of the gasket itself. So you want to try to go for the one that has the tighter fit. One thing that we noticed when we were pulling these out is that this is actually all plastic with a brass cap on it. You can see where the brass has made it to the plastic here. Also notice that these are just friction fit. They're held in by these little plastic keepers. You want to be real careful when you're taking this out. You want to walk this out real careful so that you don't snap any of these off. Chances are they don't make these anymore, and if you break them, you're going to have one devil of a time trying to get back into operation, because they all depend on this being a tight fit. Now, when you're doing the installation on them, what you want to do is take some regular Vaseline and just go into the inside rim. Not so much because it's any kind of a sealant, because Vaseline is a lubricant, and it'll make it a lot easier for you to roll the gasket into place without pinching it or tearing it or anything else. And then once it's in, it'll allow the gasket to seat somewhat easier too. So you just get it all into the inside. The Vaseline will dissolve in gasoline, so even if you get any into the float bowl itself, we're not talking major critical here. Now you just take the gasket, slowly and carefully stretch it over, roll it down till you get it over the keepers, and then very carefully just roll it into place like so, and you can smooth it out and clean up your installation. Now, float bowl will look like that on the inside. You take some emery cloth, like so, go around the bore of the hole to clean it all up. Until you get a nice, smooth and shiny looking surface. Kind of like that. Alright, once you've got that done, same basic process with some Vaseline around the outside of the the inside rather of the hole. Then it's a real simple matter, just taking the two pieces, gently pushing them into place. Once it's in, snap it into place. It's tight, it doesn't turn. You can look and you can see that all the keepers are spread and nothing's going to go anywhere. That completes your job, at least at that point. All right. All you have left to do at this point is to clean the gasket surfaces on the bowl and on the carburetor. Use some of the Ultra Blue Permatex. Get a new gasket, seal the whole thing back up, and that part of the operation for the carburetor is done.
Okay, we have the pump in now. We've checked the end gap play under this cover to check for what size gasket belongs under there. Each pump comes with 3 different size gaskets. I measured about 10 thousandths of an inch underneath there, and you're given about 10 to 25 thousandths plus that 10 thousandths for the gasket to be installed. Do yourself a favor, put some new water hose clamps on, make sure everything is down tight so you don't have any leaks. Check everything out, clean everything up. Jeff is cleaning up the intake manifold now, and we're just about ready to put that on. After we get that on, it'll be making all the connections and see if it runs.
Here's one of the things we were talking about before. We were talking about the O-ring that's on the inside of the intake manifold. Now the O-ring fits into this orifice here. This is the old one that I'm cleaning off here a little bit to show you better. All right.
Slightly flattened out.
Fairly compressed by its nature. The new one coming out of this nice little Roadster factory envelope. Looks somewhat more rounded than its original counterpart. And again, you see this the fact that the old one has been flattened a little bit, so it looks a little bit less of size than it originally was. Now all this does is this drops right into here. Nothing magical about it. You just got to make sure that it stays there. Maybe adding a little bit of the silicone gasket to two edges just as a keeper will allow it to stay in as you're turning this upside down, because you really don't want to lose this.
You'll know it if you do.
Oh, you'll know it, all right. So what we'll do is we'll just take a little bit.
You can put it all around in there. I think they even recommend that you put something in there.
We'll just coat the inside surface like so. This is the same sealant we used on the gaskets for the carburetors. Try to get it to an even, thin bead if you can. All right. A little on the edges, we'll just make sure that it stays in better. Just as a precaution, I put a little in each quadrant. Not that it's absolutely necessary. Again, you want to make sure that when you put this thing back in, because this is a considerable amount of weight that you're hefting here, that this is going to stay in place. Because if you lose this and you find it out later, it's a nightmare.
You could do it all over again.
Do it all over again. You don't really want to do that. So that's not really going to fall out. And this will compress against the face of the head. There's no indentation on the head.
Which is right there.
Which is right here. Alright, that's an absolutely flat surface, so that'll actually flatten the gasket out and tighten it up a little bit more when it's all said and done. Now, for our next trick, we're going to coat this whole surface with the gasket sealant, and we're going to put on the intake manifold gasket. would help if I put the keys.
Okay, we've given it the supreme test already. We've actually taken this car on the road. It runs, hopefully again, as soon as Jeff gets the key in. There we go. And no leaks. Well done, Jeff.
Well done, Jay. We did it.
All right.
I've got to say, your results might not be as easy as ours. We got off damn lucky that everything went straight on this without any problem at all. Hardly. We had two minor problems that came in when we first started the car up. Number one, this hose and this hose control the auxiliary air flapper that diverts warm engine air into the air cleaner. We have to replace that. Number two, we had a leaking fuel line here, and all that entails is putting on a new hose clamp to be able to knock that out. Go ahead and moved in about 6 months. So the brakes were a little bit reluctant to give up the ghost, but we got them free. We just took a couple of turns around the block. Everything seems to have hinged up real nicely. So the next step is the shakeout phase for this whole car. And I guess we'll see where we take it from there.
Okay, it's gonna fade out. Bye.